welcome everyone. As been said, I'm Melissa. I have been working with caregivers of Alzheimer's and other dementia for, a decade and a half now. And I have a website called Caregiver Wellness Resources. And so it's a real privilege to be able to do this. I'm also a licensed therapist and do quite a bit of mindfulness. And that's what our focus is today. And I've talked about boundaries before, and when we send the follow-up link, I'll send the full link to that last session that we did. I think it was like June of last year. So it'll be a little bit of a review of some of that, and also a little different. So always is. But let's start, first of all, just arriving and being present. I noticed the sun is finally coming in. We have a snowstorm here today, and I guess it's abating at the moment, which is kind of nice. So I'll offer a few suggestions. I make assumptions in accessibility. And so please modify anything that I offer you in terms of mindfulness for your own body, for how you're feeling today, what your needs are. So really making sure that you're taking care of yourself and adjusting things as you need to. So my suggestion or offering is to take your eyes just a little bit off the screen. If you have a window to look out, that's great. If you've got something lovely to let your eyes focus on, such as a photograph or even a specific color, I think is sometimes nice to do. And if it's comfortable for you to close your eyes, or you can just continue to gaze at something peaceful. And just take a moment to notice what you're sitting on. So again, that's an accessibility assumption. So just noticing your seat, how it connects to it, whether it feels heavy, soft, hard. So just noticing what connects. And then go a little further down the legs into your feet. You could tap your feet or rub your feet against the floor, wiggle your toes, march the legs, just noticing the feet. And then begin to imagine that you've got like maybe a spigot at the bottom of your feet or even underneath your seat. And you were just going to open it and let anything that happened before now just drain out. So if it's draining out the feet, just noticing that. And what does that feel like? So just even paying attention to the feet. Is there a new sensation? And again, if you don't feel the sensation, consider moving that part of the body, either shifting side to side or, again, tapping the feet. And then allow yourself just to softly exhale. Do that one more time. And then bring your attention back. One of the quickest ways to get out of the thinking mind is to allow yourself some kind of grounding exercise. And so my preference in grounding and mindfulness is to really get into the body as quickly as possible. And when I said accessibility assumptions, it means sometimes people have neuropathy in their hands or feet. So really kind of tapping into what part of the body you have the most relationship to, whether that's the hands or whether that's the feet or something you're sitting on. And as soon as you can connect to that, being curious, that's one of the key elements of mindfulness. So curious about sensation in terms of cold or warm, tingly, circulation, heaviness, lightness. And I'll ask you, as soon as you're curious about something, what happened to the thoughts that were going on in your mind? You can type it in the chat or you can unmute if you like. When you become curious, what happens to the thoughts? I'm so good at waiting. If anyone wants to type in the chat. Your thoughts move faster. Okay. So I'll ask you, And let's do this exercise together. So take your hands together. And again, assuming you have access to your hands, if not, you could use your shoulders by scrunching the shoulders and releasing, or you can use your feet, but I'll use the hands. So rubbing the hands together. And as you're doing that, what happens with your curiosity? What are you observing as you rub your hands? You can, this is rhetorical, obviously, you can't type and rub at the same time. So I'm observing some warmth, really curious about the coldness still on the back of my hands. And then when you feel ready, you can release that. Is there a tingling? Is there a little more circulation than before? And if you're really noticing that, I would be curious if your thoughts are speeding up or slowing down. I don't know. You can reserve the right to change your prior answer. Typically, when we get really curious about something, it creates like a speed bump. And that's exactly, there you go. I love it. Perhaps we'll be able to focus more. When we get curious, it enables us to create like this ability to pause that maybe we didn't have before, because that's the difference between reacting and responding. So if I have a thought and I'm not super conscious of it, I'm just thinking. Typically, we're just doing, right? If you think about 80% of the things you do throughout the day, they're usually rote or routine. Like for example, I wouldn't ask you how to type. You would just start typing if that's something you're familiar with, right? So you just do. If you're used to making coffee, you're not really actually thinking, I'm going to do this and then this, unless you're learning it for the first time. So the majority of the things that we do are quite habitual, which is reactionary. So that also tells me that we're capable of change, that there is this quality of impermanence to us, whether it's in feelings and even thoughts, or creating new habitual patterns. So if it's true that you can learn how to type or learn how to make coffee, or if you think of any skill that you have, maybe you rode a bike as a kid, and maybe you could still ride a bike now, right? So there's this body memory that happens. It becomes embedded somatically and also in our nervous system. It also tells me we have the capacity for change. And the capacity for change is what creates really healthy connection, because we're one way, right? We have traits and we have a personality and we have needs and we have values. All of these things become the tapestry of who we are, including everything that's happened before today. And it makes us a unique and I think fascinating individual. And then we meet someone we want to connect with, maybe because we have similarities, or we have things that we both like, or maybe it's a connection that you have no choice with. Could be someone you work with, it could be someone you live with, a family member, someone that you care for. And then you have these two, right? You have yourself and you have this other person. How do you create healthy connection? And I believe it's in our ability to be generous with each other, assuming the best, being malleable or adaptable. How can we be flexible? One day, one person is maybe going to have quite a day, and we might need to give 80%. And maybe you're the person the next day that's had a really bad day, and the other person needs to give 80%. So the percentage isn't always going to be equal. Maybe you're a caregiver and it's just always 100%. And so how do we then get our needs met elsewhere? So relationship and connection requires this ability to change within ourselves. So while I'm going to talk about boundaries and connection and how that interweaves with mindfulness today, really we're looking at a lens and a mirror toward ourselves. Because if we don't hold healthy boundaries in ourselves, how can we expect that in relationship or connection to someone else? And so it's really, really valuable. I had a client recently who had this aha moment. She's someone who always says yes, yes, yes to others. And because she values reliability and being that person others can count on. And she gets a lot of meaning from that. And that's valuable unless we don't count on ourselves. So we have to be reliable to ourselves, meaning we're going to do what we say we're going to do and not put others always ahead of ourselves. There has to be that seesaw, that ability to give more some days and less other days and find balance over time, because reliability to self and accountability to self is the beginning of healthy boundaries with other people. So, and of course, in mindfulness, there's the middle path. So remember that each and everything that we do, we've got to find that way to kind of navigate it. If we're saying definitives like always and never, we can get into a little bit of trouble with ourselves and others. So being overly restrictive isn't helpful. And also always holding back can also be an indication of a lack of trust, lack of self-trust, or a lack of trust in others. Whew. So there's a little bit to unpack today. I'm going to start with someone who, and you may have seen this clip before, but I feel like in a matter of 10 minutes, it encapsulates my entire talk. So we may decide to say goodbye at the end of it, but I doubt it. So I'm going to play, and I always joke that she's like my pretend BFF. Yeah. Brene Brown. Okay. Here we go. And let me know, Ben, you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
I'll let you know. Yep.
One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because so I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay. Then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I did not, that I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. That's what I assumed. Yeah, right. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was someone family member who was constantly like, I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought, my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some like technique so that you can do that. That's really like a way of being to like nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act, because the life you change first is your own.
You love yourself.
Yeah. And so my question is big, B-I-G. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you. But generosity can't exist without boundaries, and we are not comfortable setting boundaries because we care more about what people will think, and we don't want to disappoint anyone. We want everyone to like us, and boundaries are not easy. But I think they're the key to self-love, and I think they're the key to treating others with loving kindness. Sustaining. You can't, nothing is sustainable without boundaries. I think compassion and empathy are different things. And again, I'm relying on my data for this. I think compassion is a deeply held belief that we're inextricably connected to each other by something rooted in love and goodness. I call that God. Not everybody calls that God. My dad would call it fishing. Fishing?
Is it fishing?
No, there's no G in fishing.
Okay.
But I think compassion is a deeply held belief. I think empathy is the skill set to bring compassion alive. So empathy is something we can teach. I mean, it's something we've taught our kids since they were very little. It's about how to communicate that deep love for people in a way so that people don't know they're not alone. I think there's a lot of new interesting information out there about empathy not being a good thing, about that, you know, there's an argument that says, you know, if Travis is in struggle and I practice empathy with you, I'm taking on your darkness, and it leads to burnout, and it leads to, but empathy is not feeling for somebody. It's feeling with them. It's touching a place in me that knows where you've been, so I can look at you and say, me too, brother. You're not alone in this. And I find empathy to be infinite. I think it gives back tenfold what you put out.
It's sustaining. Like if you've done the work and you have your boundaries, I mean, you could tread that water forever and never get tired.
Okay, so empathy. I'm quoting Travis here, empathy. If you've done your work and set your boundaries, you can tread that water forever. Yeah. Amen. It's not finite, and it keeps giving back to us. And so this idea that, but here we go back to where we started this conversation. Empathy minus boundaries is not empathy. Compassion minus boundaries is not genuine. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So you see that there's a huge riff here, which is boundaries are freaking important.
Right.
And it's not, they're not fake walls. They're not separation. Boundaries are not division. They're respect. There's here's what's okay for me and here's what's not.
Ooh. I don't know how many of you feel like you want to listen to it again, but I'll send the link in the follow-up so everyone can if they'd like to. I would love to hear. It was a little bit hard to hear. Okay, yeah, great. Well, I'll send the link to that then. What is something that you could hear and get out of that video? What was the most impactful thing you just heard? Put in the chat box. One thing that really stood out for me. Did anyone hear the acronym for BIG? Was boundaries so that I can stay in my integrity and that I can assume the best in other people. So that principle of generosity. Yeah. Yeah. What is a boundary that you hold yourself to? So she defined boundaries as what's okay and what's not okay. Another way that I think of it is the energy or space between me and someone else and what's acceptable in that space. And that could be physically, mentally, emotionally, um, or in general principles, such as like cultures and norms and things like that as well. Boundaries are respect for myself. Nice. I love that definition. Someone else wrote that I'm not great at boundaries, but sustainable and respectful outcome of boundaries is needed. Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, the biggest message in working with other people with boundaries and in working with myself, um, you have to start right here, right with yourself. Ooh, that's exciting. Uh, so I do have a Mac, but I don't know how to make those interesting visuals not happen. I heard that that happens. Um, yeah, someone else wrote, I struggle with boundaries being restrictive, and then love is not shown enough. Oh, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. If you have a particular question, or yeah, that's an interesting way to put that. And and I and you mentioned love there. Love is not shown enough. I think the comment that she made about compassion, compassion is rooted in kindness, and respect, and in love, right? And so whatever our definitions of those are, and so that compassion actually has an action element to it. So, for example, we see a need and we feel a need, and that's an act of compassion. Empathy, which I love her clarity on that. Empathy is where we are feeling with someone as opposed to feeling for them. Feeling for them is kind of that new definition of empathy. Like you hear a lot about empaths, or maybe you're an Instagram person, so there's lots of memes and reels on that. Being an empathic person, and that's when you take on someone's energy. And as a caregiver, that's easy to begin to absorb. So, for example, if someone is having a really bad day, and that negativity is being spouted toward you or toward the environment, right? How does that make you feel? Right? Usually brings us down as well. And so very difficult to continue to have a shield against when someone is deciding to share that negativity or that mood. And so that's a way that we can begin to establish a boundary. We can either choose to physically remove ourselves to create more of a physical space boundary. We can actually say or communicate what a need is. And so that need would be, hey, I thank you for sharing how you feel. I'm kind of having a little bit of a day. I'm going to take some space here. Or gosh, when I hear you say that, it just makes me really sad to hear. Tell me what you're needing right now. Do you need comfort, or do you need a solution? So there's ways to kind of approach that and be very specific, especially if you cannot remove yourself from the room. um, and there's ways to be and to make and communicate requests that are healthy. So we're going to dive a little bit into that. Let's do one more sort of just grounding for a moment. So again, you can take your eyes just a little bit off the screen and really just notice that your body is already breathing. Like, you don't have to make your body breathe. It's autonomic. It is a skill that you've had since birth. But now notice that you can begin to change your pattern of breathing. So for example, you can make your inhales a little longer, and you can make your exhales a little bit longer. So just really begin to notice that you can change the length of the breath. And now notice that you can actually change the volume of your breath, and consider, as you're breathing in and out, noticing where your breath feels really shallow. So I'm noticing that my breath is kind of up here in my chest, which is pretty normal when I'm talking. And I'm going to place my hand on my belly. And then as I breathe in, I'm going to try to push my hand out a little bit. And then as I breathe out, I'm going to notice my hand come back in. If you're noticing another part of the body that just feels really stagnant, you can put your hand there and imagine breathing into it. You could even do that in your shoulder, your lungs attached at the top of your shoulder. So notice if you can feel some movement as you breathe in and out. And then you can relax your hands and just take a couple more breaths and notice what feels different or the same about your breathing now. And when you're ready, you can bring your eyes back. So just again, that element of mindfulness, which is curiosity, just by noticing, gosh, I am breathing. What is it like? Is it long? Is it short? Is it shallow? Is it deep? Where do I not feel it? Where do I feel it? And those little moments, it took us less than a minute. Those little moments create those opportunities to create some spaciousness in thoughts. And what they do physiologically is they reset your nervous system. So if you're feeling quite anxious or the mind chatter is really going, or something negative was said, you can actually do this without anybody even noticing or knowing, right? You can begin to flip that inner attention to, what is my breathing like? What would I like to see change? How is it now? How is it after? Takes a few seconds. And just that little spaciousness can change the way that you react or respond with yourself and with another person. It can be incredibly powerful if you allow it. So I'm going to just share my screen here for a moment. Hang on. Let's see. All right. I'm going to dive into kind of a little bit of the how-tos for this last segment of our time together. I noticed some of the comments. Gosh, not enough time in the day to do it all. Yeah, no kidding. Boundaries are a quiet place for me, a breathing pause, practices with creative play. Others of you mentioned you struggle with boundaries, and that boundaries are respect for self. And so let's just dive into a little bit of the how-tos to make this a little more practical. And so when we think about boundaries, we have to be in touch with what our needs are. What we need and what we value. And so this is just a sort of a general snapshot. And so I would be curious if you have a pen and a piece of paper to jot down a few things that feel like are really important for you. And let me say first and foremost, when you're thinking about boundaries, the number one thing, and the way that boundaries actually become healthy, is the element of safety. So you'll see at the very beginning of the universal needs list, right, is our basic needs being met and a sense of security or safety. Without feeling embodied safety, there is a need for stronger boundaries, or actually, right, a disconnect from that relationship. Because if you are not safe physically, you need to leave the room. If there needs to be some sort of intervention with family in order to create emotional safety, whether that's therapy, whether that's help from someone else, an outside source, whether it's looking at medication change, all these different things, so much comes into play in terms of safety. And that is fundamental for creating healthy boundaries. We often, it's a big indicator if we're not feeling safe with another person, and safety could also be trust. So for example, if someone has violated our trust, shared something that was meant to be in confidence, that's an opportunity for us, instead of saying, I'm done with this person, right? Saying and using our communication skills, when you shared what I shared that was confidential with you, I felt really violated and upset. My request of you in the future is that the things that I share with you stay with you so that I know that I can trust you. Would you be willing to do that? And then they have an opportunity to say yes or to say no. And that is incredibly powerful because then it affords the other person an opportunity for change, but it also gives you a sense of resiliency by using effective communication tools. So if you haven't jotted down a few things that are important for you in a healthy relationship, or even you can think of this in terms of a future relationship, um, as a sort of a sandwich generation, I'm still have an 18-year-old at home, and then I have aging parents. I'm a long distance caregiver for one parent, and the other one I'm quite nearby for. Um, there's always these things kind of brewing for me, being sort of in the sandwich generation, and it doesn't leave a lot of time for friendships. And so I have a small number of friends, and looking at my needs and values have helped me determine where I want to invest probably the most precious resource I have, which is my time. And who do I want to invest my time in? And looking at what my needs are, it really helps me evaluate which friendships help me invest my time in. I want to feel emotionally safe with them. I want to have humor. I want to be able to connect well. I don't want it to feel like an obligation. I also want to feel some sense of nurturing. Like, did they just text me to say they care about me? And am I doing that in reciprocity? So those kinds of things are important for me. So I would be curious. Feel free to type in the chat box, maybe some of the things that kind of are standing out for you that feel really important in terms of understanding needs. And I'll take a quick glance to see if anyone's put anything there. Y'all are quiet today. All right, feel free to do that. And I'm going to go back to my screen here as well. So what are some things that we want to look at in terms of personal boundaries? And that's safety. So I love that someone said that boundaries for them are a sense of self-respect. It's, putting ourselves in situations in which we do feel safe. And if that's not possible, do we have the capacity and the ability to remove? Know our bottom lines. So what are my needs? What are my values? And this goes with a boundary conversation. This goes with relationships, familial relationships versus intimate relationships, work relationships. When you understand what you value and what you need, you can begin performing actions that really align with them. It's everything. I really, really think the starting point of understanding what's okay and what's not okay in our lives is having a really crisp understanding of what our personal needs and values are. And it helps us set a baseline. Saying yes to your no and having agency. So what is agency? Agency is our capacity to have a greater allegiance to self over maybe even cultural norms or rules, or over the people that we think very highly of or want to please. So whether that's a boss or a family member or a parent or a sibling, we often sometimes in those cases have difficulty saying no. And when we have difficulty in saying no to those types of things, it really is this report of ourselves that there is generally a need to please over holding ourselves in higher allegiance. So whenever we're saying yes or no, what's okay and what's not okay, we also want to look at Is there a little bit of an index here? There isn't always, it comes back to that sort of 80-20 rule that I talked about when we first started. There isn't always going to be an equalness. The person you care for might have depression and requires specific or different types of mental illness and require really specific skills. And I would say this boundary conversation might not necessarily apply to that. You might have a different set of rules and things that are in place for safety, because you're dealing with either cognitive impairment or someone's inability to meet your needs, right? They need more care than they can give care for you. But when we look at cultivating healthy relationships, being able to have that sense of agency is critical. And it means that we have to hold our integrity and our values of the most importance. So how we communicate that is pretty critical. And I'm going to go over that quick cheat sheet with you all in just a moment. Assuming the best, right? So, and that's not just in the other person. Brene Brown talked a lot about generosity, and generosity is assuming that people are just doing the best they can. Now, when do we not continue to give people more and more and more chances, right? Is when their actions continuously either misalign with their words, and they've created a pattern that it is severed trust. And then we get an opportunity to decide, okay, I am not going to entrust this person with my deepest thoughts and feelings because they've proven otherwise. And even after me communicating, please don't do that. And so, there is this time and place in which we want to offer generosity, but we also need to believe people for what they are creating. In other words, are their actions matching with their own integrity? And if that answer is no, then we have to create more, right, boundaried space between us. And one of the other definitions I love is the energetic space between me and another person, and then what that looks like in between. Respecting boundaries, not just implementing them. So once you set a boundary, for example, here's a boundary that I sometimes have to set with a family member. I will say, when I hear you speak negatively about someone I really love, it really hurts, and I feel really distraught over that, because I value uplifting other people, encouraging other people. I do value knowing your opinion, but not when it's not useful or solution oriented. So my request of you in the future is to really think about how you can be maybe more kind, or don't say it at all. And that's something I had to say over the holidays. So not an easy conversation, but it was better received than I thought it would be. And I felt really proud of myself for being courageous enough to say it. So we can't just simply say it one time. You have to say it many, many, many times. It's kind of like, I don't know how many of you are parents, a parent of a teen and now two young adults. The drinking and the sex conversation had to happen over and over and over and over again. So as they got older, also the internet rules had to happen over and over and over and over again. So there was a reiteration and a continuous upholding. So I couldn't just say it once and expect it to happen. I had to actually be willing to maintain and reinforce the boundaries. And then waiting. This is an element of mindfulness which will actually empower you. And what I mean by this is oftentimes we'll make a request of someone else and expect immediate change, a miracle or a magic wand. And that's just not always possible. So if there is ever a moment that you can create waiting, whether that's in a conversation itself. So for example, let's say you want to communicate a boundary, but you're feeling really angry. Waiting would be a really good idea. So can you go to the bathroom? Can you drink some water? Can you just step out of the room and then come back in the room and notice if that emotional temperature has changed just a little bit? Anything that you can do that's worth doing would also be worth having a wait or a pause so that you can feel emotionally regulated. When you create connections with others, I used that example earlier of someone who comes into the room and they spout off their negative day, right? Let's imagine someone comes in the room and they've had like a really amazing day, right? And they're joyful, or they ask you how you are. Notice, right, how that makes you feel. There is definitely an infectiousness when we approach and communicate others. And so noticing how you are first will enable you to create change in your relationship to someone else. How do you enter a room? What's the first thing you say? Are you curious about others in wanting to connect? Or are you curious about others so that you can notice how they perceive you, for example? um, so really kind of like working right on your ability to connect instead of assuming that it's everyone else's job to connect well with you. It's pretty powerful. All right, a couple more thoughts. Feel free to type anything in the chat box. I feel like I had a lot of material today, and yeah. Okay. I'm going to suggest a little homework assignment if you're willing. And I'm going to use this acronym of SOAR, SOAR. And if you've got a pen, you can jot this down. So the inventory is reflect on, and you can just jot their initials down perhaps. Reflect on a friendship, could be a coworker, could be an intimate partner, but it's not a family member. With family members are connections that were not chosen. Pick a connection that was a chosen connection, and pick a connection that's positive for you. So at the top of the paper, I'm writing inventory, and then I'm writing their initials of that person. And then I'm thinking about what needs of mine and what values are met when I reflect on this person. So I'm going to write down need, value. And we'll do just a really short version. Maybe write 1 or 2 needs or values that are met when you think about this person. So my 2 are like deep connection, and I could write so many more, but I'm going to say thoughtful. It's just so thoughtful. Asking how I am, how another family member is. That's something that I really value, is someone who genuinely wants to care or care for me. Okay. So once you've written that down, now you're going to write down the initials of, it could be a sibling, a family member, a parent. And on a scale of 0 to 10, maybe pick a 5. Let's not go with the most complicated relationship that you have for this inventory, unless you have a therapist or you're ready for some deep introspection. Maybe pick a 5 out of the 0 to 10. 10 being kind of like pretty intense, 0 being really benevolent, just loving kindness, embodies the Buddha, or whatever it is that really feels like, oh, this is like just a wonderful familial relationship. So we did an inventory of maybe a friendship, someone that we're not related to, that was just really uplifting for us. This next inventory is is so that you can look at what patterns that might be in your life that you might not be aware of. And so you can choose a parent, a sibling, someone that is deeply connected to you. So I'm going to put initials of that person there. And then I'm going to write what I get in terms of needs and values from them. And then you can add another column of the things that you're not getting. So unmet needs. So at the top, you've got needs and then unmet needs. And you might just jot one or two down in terms of needs that are met. Integrity, I'm going to put. And considerate. And then unmet needs, you might list one or two. Then in the next column, you're going to look at, after you've listed the needs, the unmet needs, then you're going to look at what's my role. So as you reflect on those unmet needs, for example, is there anything there that kind of stands out for you that feels like, oh, wow, I noticed that, that they're not a very good listener. Is that because maybe I'm not a good listener also? Or I'm not curious about them and I don't really want to hear about them complain. So maybe that's why I don't ask questions. So it just really gives some opportunity for reflection there. Do I have a role or a part in this? And it could be that maybe I'm enabling. Maybe I just go along with it, or maybe I call them and then I just disassociate. I clean the whole house and I just let them go on and on and on. I'm, allowing them to break my boundary of taking up more of my time. That is absolutely unnecessary. So when you look at what your role is, and then consider asking yourself, what would I like to change within me? So change is huge. When we spend a lot of time really hyper focused on the past or trying to control our future, we can get really stuck in either in regret or trying to prevent things from happening, meaning that we think more that we can control it, that maybe it won't happen. But if we can reflect with this idea that things can change, that there is possibilities, that and think about yourself maybe 10 years ago, right? You're probably very different. So you have the capacity for change, but by reflecting on what would I like to change? What would I like to be different? It actually gives you a rudder to begin to move in that direction. It doesn't mean, right, we need to make radical changes overnight, but it creates in mindfulness what we call just conscious awareness. And by doing this exercise, it enables you to have just a little sliver of conscious awareness. So here's some other thoughts for SOAR. So S stands for see. Identify where the story began. So if you're reflecting on what is my role in this, there might be a particular thing or an image or a scenario that happened that really helps you kind of identify how you can look at what your part is. And then own it. What's true in this? What are both sides? Can you be really curious? And then be present. Notice the stressors that kind of pull you back into the story. Maybe is there a pattern that you do in many relationships, whether it's people pleasing or avoidance? Is there certain patterns that you have that are playing over and over again in relationships that you have? And then what boundaries need to happen in order for you to break this pattern? Can you let your yes be yes and your no be no? Another phrase that I say is, can you say yes to your no? In other words, can you have that higher allegiance and agency to yourself than to other people? Because without, being thoroughly nourished and taken care of, it is very difficult to take care of others. And then rewrite. So SOAR is see, own it, awaken, and rewrite. What do you want your news story to be? So as we are taking these new boundary skills into our relationships, and as we're just starting to be aware of, right, how our words and our actions and our energy affect other people and affect ourselves, what do we want it to look like? What would be the starting point to ignite something? So let's close with just another mindfulness exercise, and you can take your eyes just a little bit off the screen, and let's take that last question, rewrite. And maybe you had an image in your mind of either a scenario, a person, and just allow yourself to picture that for a moment. And then notice any emotions that come up for you. So maybe there's frustration, or maybe there's joyfulness. Maybe there is anxiousness at the idea of wanting or hearing that maybe I have to change. So just noticing what emotion arrives for you, and then notice, where does that land in your body? Mine is kind of right here in my chest. Sometimes when I think about communicating with others, when I don't want to, I get a little tightness in my throat. And then take just about 20 seconds to play a little movie in your mind of things going well, having this conversation, connecting with this person, and noticing that it's going well. Notice your shoulders drop. Notice the softness in your face. Doesn't matter if it goes well or not, just imagining it going well in this moment. And then allow yourself to exhale. And then bring your eyes back to the screen. All right. This is a lot. And if you want to dive into boundaries some more, we'll send that follow-up link to the session that we did this last summer for boundaries. There's also some references I'll put in there of a few books and some things that I have found really helpful in setting boundaries. One of which is a great book that I just picked up over the holidays called Real Self-Care. And I really have been enjoying it. Super practical, not like earth-shattering stuff. But I imagine if you implemented a few of them, it would be. So I think this is a really good one as well. Incidentally, a lot of these books, I don't know how many of you have a library card, but I usually listen on audio, and of course, using your public library is free. So. All right, I'm gonna, for the sake of time, we'll end our recording here, and I'll stay just a couple more minutes. If anyone has any questions, you feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. Thank you so much, Ben, for hosting today. I really appreciate you.
No, thank you, Melissa. I appreciate it. I took some notes here, and
Do you have questions?
I'm gonna have to review them after this, because this was good. There's a lot of information. It was
There's
good.
a lot today, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone that joined us. And I appreciate just taking the time to care for yourself as well as for others, and attempt to grow and learn. Our next session will be February 5th on grief, growth, or both. A primer on recovering after emotional upheaval. I'm sorry, I'm dyslexic, so reading's a little difficult. I'm excited about that one, especially after this season of life. So, but thank you all for being here. And yeah, Melissa will stick around for a few minutes, but I'm gonna stop the recording there.